Welcome to my Lunch and Learn session, where I'm going to be asking the question, what can networks do for young people? This has been prepared for colleagues in West Sussex. I'm hoping I might be able to join you, but in case, I've decided to record the session and at the very least be able to talk to you later. During this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about social capital and the impact that that can have on young people and how it can be a tool to understand how we can support young people better and maybe even how we might be able to better assess the support that they need going forward. Today we're going to look at the background to social capital and in particular looking at the work of Putnam and Coleman. And I'm then going to explore Coleman's framework because I think that offers us something quite tangible that we can use in practice. As with any good academic, I'm then going to offer some critiques of the model, why I think we need to be cautious about just charging in, and then reflecting back, why does it matter in children, young people and learning? Following all of that, a few points for discussion which I hope will start to bring it alive for you. So the question is, why am I interested in this? Well, initially it stems from the research I undertook between 2013 and 2016 when I looked at the role of social capital and its contribution towards the care of adults. Particularly looking at older adults and people with learning disabilities. And what I was able to identify was that there was social capital in both groups, which was not my initial hypothesis, but I was able to demonstrate there was social capital in both groups, and I actually used Coleman's framework as the initial analytical tool to identify social capital. But what I was able to do was also recognise that social capital was not being mobilised by people and that there were organisational barriers to this. And part of my hypothesis, part of my thesis results was that I believed that in not recognising social capital, what organisations were doing was they were actually systematising disadvantage for those two groups of individuals. That by not recognising social capital, what was happening was that people were unable to use all the resources available to them to their advantage to better the quality of life that they had. And in fact what I saw was that the people who were able to do that were getting a better quality of life. So it's something about mitigating disadvantage. And what this did was this left me the question, I've shown it in terms of adults, but is there something as well in terms of children? And that's one of the reasons why I want to go back to the history of social capital, because that really does ask that question of us today. Background. So Coleman first published his paper on social capital in 1988. He was part of a wider movement that looked at how people succeeded in society, which was very much kicked off by the French sociologist Bourdieu, about how people benefited from participation in organisations, which is the work of Robert Putnam, and how people gained and maintained economic benefit, which is what Coleman offered. The link between all of them is that they all saw that in communities, individuals sought to create networks to establish their role and from this to extract benefits. And it has to be said, Coleman's work is related to the ideas of human capital, which were set out by Becker, with social capital really being almost like a subgroup of it. but one that looks beyond what do I have as an individual, but started to look at how these resources, abilities, these skills, this knowledge was then used to create impact. Robert Putnam was a political scientist writing in the late 90s, early 2000, and he was interested in how organisations and groups within a community interacted with society as a whole. And what he put forward was that actually there were two different types of networks, very similar to social network analysis that you might have heard of, but what he did was he grouped them into bonding social capital, where we talk about networks that are particularly ones that we benefit from, typically with family and friends, and with bridging social capital, the links through groups and organisations that we can benefit from, but which are typically work colleagues and other group members that are likely to be less committed to us, but which we might well still gain some sort of an input. Okay, so moving on to Coleman's framework. So Coleman was working, as I mentioned earlier, in the late 80s in Chicago, where he was working with pupils in the what we would call secondary school system, and he was interested to find that there were young people that appeared to have the same resources, the same background on paper, yet achieved very differently. And he started exploring this with their families and with the young people to understand why some young people did better than others when they appear to have the same initial resources. And what he did was he identified 6 attributes that made a difference, and he called them obligations and expectations, information potential, norms and effective sanctions, authority relations, appropriable social organisations, and intentional organisations. And what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is actually go through those 6 attributes, a bit of a definition and a bit of an explanation as to how we might recognise those in our work today. Looking at the first of the attributes, we're looking at obligations and expectations, and that is very much as you might expect. It's about the favours owed to us or which we owe to others. It is noted that these are rarely of direct economic value, but what they do is they enable us to move towards a goal. And often it is that people, you can pick up a phone and somebody says, oh yes, I can have a word with somebody for you, or yes, I'm sure we could do something. And that of course asks the question, who can we rely on to put a word to support us? What actions can we call upon from others? Depending on where it is, we will all have different answers, but what we recognise with successful people is that they do have that network that they can call upon. Now there is also the question, are these obligations from people with a strong link to us, which is those bonding links we were talking about, or people doing it as part of an organisational role, which maybe becomes a bridging link? And that's where I think it's useful just to be aware of how likely it is that somebody will do something based on the idea of what level of obligation, what level of expectation there is that they might owe you or those close to you. Information potential. For me, this is one of the important aspects, and it's about how do we know how to manage within a community, within society. And it's recognised that networks around us often give us that information. So it's asking, how do you get a job? How do you deal with that insurance company? It's all these little things we teach young people as they're growing up that comes through families, through friends, through contacts, through school, that actually help the young person make their way in society. But it's also about actually, where do the parents get their information from? And you may have noticed I say on the slide, how do we account for the information they may get from social media such as Mumsnet? We're all very aware of the norms and sanctions that every community has. And it's about, how do we pass on that information to others? And how do people that we're responding to, how do they pick up what is the anticipated behaviours? And these behaviours are very much how a community, how a society manages itself. So we know, for instance, that one of the unwritten rules is about how you follow process, how you relate to a political organisation such as the council. And I'm thinking in my head, only recently we had Romesh Ranganathan going on telly about how he didn't get the school he wanted for one of his children. And actually, by going on telly at an early stage, was he not breaking one of those norms of behaviour because he'd failed to follow a process? And was he aware of the sanctions that would ensue by his behaviour? And the question is, he's a person that's very much in the public eye. How much more disadvantaged is it for a young person who doesn't have a strong network around them if they're going to be breaking some of these norms of behaviour? Coleman also recognised how important it was for people to understand, in any community, any society, how to manage authority relations. And this is relationships with people who are decision makers, people who have influence. Some of this is cultural, some of this is behavioural, but it's how do we understand all of that? How do we use our networks in order to gain that information, in order to be able to then effectively relate to the organisation, to relate to the community, in order to gain resources for us and for those that we're involved in. And one of the things that comes up very often is that we teach young people how to relate to teachers, how to relate to school authority, potentially even social workers. And then they move into the world of work, and suddenly it's all changed. And employers often complain that young people just aren't work ready. And that's all about, they don't understand the different authority relationships, the different norms and the sanctions that go with it. Just taking a quick break as we're about halfway through the model. Are there any questions, any observations that people want to think about? We might want to pause this recording for a moment while the group think through what I've said, and when you're ready we'll move on to the next section, which is looking at how people relate to organisations. Okay, coming back to Coleman's framework, I'm now going to look at the organisational aspects of social capital. And the first one is the idea that there are organisations you can become involved in where you join with people who have already created an organisation, but one where you might be able to access resources or change policy that is more related to you and your position. And this is about reflecting that often in society it's very hard to be heard as a single voice, and therefore people get together, but some of these groups might be not quite what you're looking at, and therefore can you then create a subgroup within that bigger organisation that is more related to where you want to be. And we often see this with groups, that bigger national groups that may well have local groups that relate specifically to the local authority. Now I'm thinking of organisations like MenCap who have that local network, but also you might have a national organisation that then has a special interest group that possibly looks at specific children with specific needs, and like for instance autism and ADHD within the wider parent advocacy group. And finally, we're talking about intentional organisations, about coming together with others of a similar interest to support each other and potentially advocate for change. This is where we're talking about much tighter groups, something that has a very specific purpose, and it may well be that they come together and then disband at the end. The focus of the groups could be varied. It could be about increasing knowledge, could be about creating influence, or it could just be to offer each other support. Often there's a motivation around advocating or delivering change or creating access to common resources. And these are based on the idea of bridging links, but are much more likely than appropriate organisations to result in bonding links, where individuals have that shared experience that takes them forward. And I'm just thinking as I'm saying this about Mr. Bates and the post office, where the postmasters to start with were just coming together because of a shared problem with their, I can't exactly call it employers, their main client, but created some very strong bonds between individuals as a result of the campaigning that they're doing. And if I was to look quite locally, I'd be looking at things like the Care Leavers Advisory Board and the Children in Care Council, where the young people have a focus, but actually a lot of the time they're also supporting each other, and often with some of the earlier aspects of social capital that we talked about. And finally, as we conclude this session, just wanted to give a couple of trigger questions that might help with the discussion going forward. What I want to think about are the following points. First question that I think about is that in children's social care, our focus traditionally has always been on the physical and emotional safety of the young person in the moment. And that's often because when we're intervening, it's done at what is seen as a moment of crisis. So whilst all of that's going on, how do we also simultaneously engage in thinking about support for the young person in order to create a successful base for the future? And that's quite an interesting challenge. And I know people will say to me, and I would have said exactly the same when I was in practice, which is, so much is happening, so much is required. How on earth do you have that spare capacity to think about the future? And I think part of my response to that is you don't. But maybe by understanding what is important for that young person in the future, maybe what we can do is identify some key things to try and preserve whilst all of that busy work is happening. So that was the first question. Secondly, is there a role for us as professionals, both in and outside of school, in talking to young people about promoting aspects of social knowledge and information, about how to maximise gains from engaging with groups and with society, and how to adapt to different authorities in organisations? And I'm just going to pick out a couple of elements from that, in that we talk about how do you maximise gains from engaging with groups and societies. We know young people inevitably are drawn to different peer groups and social groupings, and it's about helping understand what that means and how that can have a long-term benefit. And that may well then influence their choice of which groups they wish to associate with, rather than it just being something that's done in the moment. And then finally, I've mentioned a number of times the concept of bonding and bridging links. And really the question is it helpful to think about that type of relationship when we're doing assessments? Is it worth thinking about what are the strong relationships, where do relationships come from, and what is their sustainability? And I know that takes us very close to another field called social network analysis. And I don't think, it needs significant refresh, but that's a different discussion. What I also think is that it adds a level of complexity that we don't have time to do. Is something short and, I would argue, somewhat crude, the concept of bridging and bonding, is that something that's helpful at a practice terms to take us through the various networks, the various support that young people and their families benefit from? So I'm going to throw this open to a wider discussion now. Thank you very much for listening to me so far, and I look forward to a discussion. Having explored the model, let's now think about some of its limitations as well as where it's been strong. The first thing that always comes up is going to be that it's linked to the idea of rational choice theory, something that Becker was very much promoting. And that sees success in terms of competitive advantage. So it's about getting the better school place, getting the better exam results, making more profit ultimately for the organisation, for the individual. So rational choice theory, all about the idea of social competition. And of course, not everybody is into that. Not everybody is out to get the best possible financial reward for every transaction. Sometimes, and we know this through game theory, people are actually looking for something that may be intangible but is right for them. Although the research was based around an understanding of pupil success, the actual metrics that Coleman was using really was about an analysis of the family. So it's about how did the parents create success for their children, which is often quite a reasonable discussion. I mean, he spends a lot of time looking at how minority groups that strongly favour education are able to, through their networks, to create success for their children. But it's about actually the family unit function rather than the individual child's networks and functions. And I think that's a challenge for us when we're often working with young people whose family links, whose family functions may well be quite weak, may be chaotic. I think there is also something for me about how the model relates to different groups. There's quite a lot of work in social capital currently going on where it is starting to look at how does social capital appear in different functional groups. What I haven't seen so far is it being related that strongly to some of the groups that we work with in social work. And I think what I was doing in terms of looking at older adults and people with learning disabilities was one of the early pieces of work being done specifically in the social work realm. For me, social capital remains quite an esoteric concept. the practice aspect has yet to be developed. The other area where there's been limited work is actually, we're talking about how does social capital create success. I think there's also something about how does social capital create disadvantage. Those who have weak social capital, who have weak networks, are we missing the fact that that lack of networks actually then compounds disadvantage, makes it harder to move away from the discrimination that maybe you felt as a child, and it then be self-replicating. And that could be part of the discussion as to why disadvantage often is multi-generational. And finally, why does social capital matter to children, young people and learning? I think there's something about recognizing the different aspects of social capital. What is it that parents, what is it that families do to create advantage, and through that manage the process, the procedures and the policies that we try to create to make fair decisions for young people. Are we actually creating a system that supports the best organised, the best aware families, those who understand best how to deal with authority figures? I think that's something we often say we try and do, and it's, I think, being aware and having it as part of an open dialogue and saying, actually, this is how families manage the system. Conversely, as families struggle, is it a situation where those with limited social capital are the ones that could be expected to need statutory support, that they don't have the people that help them manage the chaos in their lives, manage the disadvantage in their lives, that then statutory services get involved to address? And of course you then ask the question, how does preventative work use an understanding of social capital in order to manage some of the risks around a family? And that then starts linking to the idea of strengths-based working, something we've talked about, but I think often it's a policy agenda that hasn't got a clear underpinning of what does that look like in practice. And I think maybe social capital could be helping in that discussion. And then finally, we're talking about young people in alternative accommodation as being an area of disadvantage. It's something that we've recognised, that young people in care are now a protected group within West Sussex. And part of that is because when they enter into alternative accommodation, we often split them up, not for any good reason, but actually we just don't have a choice. We're having to take the placements that are available. We're having to try and match the young person with appropriate carers and so on. The end result is that we often, those bridging links that we talked about right at the beginning, those weaker, those organisational, community focus links are the first to go. The young person starts missing football club training that maybe has been a big source of support for them, and it's teaching them issues about dealing with authority, the referee, dealing with norms and obligations. There's all sorts of stuff in that early part of social capital framework that we are often unable to take into account because we're having to move at 90 miles an hour, we're having to work with compromises. And the question then becomes, okay, so after the crisis, how do we look at it? How do we rebuild those links? How do we recognise what's been lost that was valuable? And I often don't think we have the chance to do that. So bridging links are probably the biggest risk, But then some of those bonding links start becoming fractured because of parental behaviours, lack of contact with extended family, moving away from neighbourhoods. So all of this is creating a really difficult environment for the young person in terms of social capital. And the question is, how do we then recreate that? How do we actively help them develop that capital that they need to succeed in society? I'm now going to think about some discussion questions. The first one, you will notice, is drawn very much from what I've just been talking about how do we support a young person to regain that social capital, those community networks, following our intervention focused on their physical and emotional safety. Knowing that we have to do some of these things, what do we do next? Are there things that we can do during that crisis period that might have a long-term benefit? Second question, about actually, as professionals, how do we promote the idea that there are resources in the community that they can benefit from? How do they learn how to use groups, how to adapt to different authorities in different organisations? And then finally, going back to my question about actually where are the links between theory and practice, and ask the question, how much do we think about relationships and assessments using terms like bonding and bridging links? Does this help give us that level of granularity in an assessment that maybe we haven't been doing so far? Discussion point. You may disagree with me. I'll leave it over to you, and hopefully I'll be with you in person to be able to engage in that discussion. Thank you ever so much for listening today, and you never know, we may come back to this subject at some point in the future. Thank you very much.